له يا سيد أنا رجعت على لبنان، أتمنى أنك ترجع كمان على لبنان.
قرار صادر من مجلس الجامعة تسمية حزب الله الإرهابي.
Good afternoon, you're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's top stories. Marda movement leader Sleiman Frangieh meets with Mufti of Tripoli and the North, Sheikh Malik al-Shahad, and rejects accusations that Future Movement chief Saad Hariri interfered in Christian affairs when he nominated him for the presidency. Armed clashes renew at the Ain al-Helwe Palestinian refugee camp in Sidon after heavy clashes erupted overnight. And the Syrian opposition says it is not optimistic about upcoming peace talks in Geneva because there is no international will for a political transition. Mufti of Tripoli and the North, Sheikh Malik al-Shahad, has received Marada movement leader MP Sleiman Frangieh at his residence in Tripoli. Frangieh rejected accusations that Future Movement chief Saad Hariri had interfered in Christian affairs when he nominated him for the presidency. Following the talks with Shahad, Frangieh said, quote, "The significant part of the agreement with Hariri is prioritizing the positive aspects instead of dwelling on the negative." Frangieh, who was not even a presidential candidate in November of 2015 when Hariri decided to endorse him, also voiced support for any consensus candidate that rival parties could agree on. Armed clashes renewed this morning at the Ain al-Helwe Palestinian refugee camp in Sidon after heavy clashes erupted overnight, leaving one person killed and several others wounded. Later during the day, a group of activists came under fire as they gathered in an area close to the clashes to press for a ceasefire. Dozens of families reportedly fled the camp as a result of the clashes that erupted between members of the Fatah movement and Islamist militants. Police has detained a well-known activist over his involvement in storming and ransacking the office of a Saudi-owned daily in Beirut a day earlier. The Internal Security Forces Information Branch detained Pierre Hashash in Batroun following a judicial order to apprehend those who were involved in the incident. Around a dozen people stormed and ransacked the Beirut offices of the Sharq al-Awsat daily after the newspaper published a caricature poking fun at Lebanon. Hashash and Abbas Zahri, another well-known activist, were among the men who broke into the offices. A video depicting the breach was recorded by Hashash and shared on his Facebook page. Sharq al-Awsat published a picture of the Lebanese flag with the caption, "April Fools, the Lebanese state." The cartoon created an uproar on social media and was widely criticized by citizens and politicians. The case of embezzlement by Internal Security Forces members was referred to the military tribunal in one of the biggest scandals ever to hit the agency. The national news agency reported that Attorney General Sherbil Abu Samra referred the probe's dossier with the detained suspects to State Prosecutor Samir Hamoud after wrapping up his preliminary investigations. Hamoud in turn handed over the case to military prosecutor Judge Sa'ir for further investigation. Earlier this week, Abu Samra kicked off an investigation into allegations that ISF members had manipulated health care bills aimed at defrauding the state out of large amounts of money. Syrian opposition member Riyad Hijab says his group is not optimistic about upcoming peace talks in Geneva because he says there is no international will for a political transition. The Syrian opposition consistently said it wanted a halt in attacks on civilians and for the Geneva talks to result in a transitional governing body for Syria that does not include President Bashar al-Assad. The Higher Negotiations Committee, Syria's main opposition bloc, will attend the next round of talks scheduled to start around April 9 in Geneva. U.S. President Barack Obama has urged world leaders to step up efforts to prevent madmen from groups such as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant from obtaining nuclear weapons, as he announced that 102 nations have ratified a treaty on the protection of nuclear materials. Speaking at a nuclear security summit in Washington, D.C., Obama said there was a persistent and evolving threat of nuclear attacks despite progress in reducing such risks. Although he said no group had succeeded in getting their hands on nuclear weapons, he pointed out, however, that Al-Qaeda had long sought them and ISIL had already used chemical weapons, including mustard gas, in Syria and Iraq. Heavy fighting has broken out between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces along the front lines of the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region. There were no immediate figures on casualties. Officials from each country blame the other for the fighting that began overnight. The Armenian Defense Ministry claimed on a Facebook post that Armenian forces in the region shot down an Azeri military helicopter, a claim denied by the Azerbaijan government. Nagorno-Karabakh has been under the control of Armenian military and separatists since the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan ended in 1994. Years of negotiations have brought little progress in resolving the dispute. Coming up next, Yumna Naufel talks U.S. elections with Dr. Jennifer Skolty. Always stay with us. Over to you, Yumna.
Thank you, Linda. As the countdown to the U.S. presidential election is underway, we have the pleasure to welcome in our studios Dr. Jennifer Skolty Awais, the Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and a Research Fellow at the Institute for Migration Studies, both at the Lebanese American University. Her research focuses on security, American politics, refugees, and migration policy. Prior to coming to Lebanon, she lived and worked in Washington, D.C. on international development. Thank you for being with us, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm going to start by talking about Donald Trump, the frontrunner in the Republican Party. You know, since he announced he was running for president last June, his rise has been kind of meteoric, to say the least. But his run has been steeped in drama and controversy as well. Talking about the Mexicans crossing the border, calling them rapists, calling for a temporary ban on Muslims entering the U.S., and most recently, just 2 days ago, asking for women who opted for abortion to be punished. So how can we explain that he's held on to this voter base despite the constant controversy?
Well, I think he's actually done well because of that controversy. I mean, if we look at Trump, I mean, one is personality. That's well known to the American public, someone who's done very well in reality TV, right? Yeah. But also, he has been able to galvanize a significant portion, particularly the Republican Party electorate, that feels that they've been left out. They've been left out of the economic progress the past 10 years, left out of elite decision making, and they're very, very upset with the status quo. And Trump has been able to harness that in some of the things that he does, policy positions he takes, and also the way that he talks about minorities in the U.S., about foreigners. So he's not only been able to harness this with being an outsider, really, at least an outsider to Washington, but because he's been able to say your problems are because of these groups of people, these type of interests.
You talk about these groups of people, these types of interests. We can't help but mention Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton as well as Bernie Sanders, which he's constantly attacking. Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton may be facing a possible FBI indictment. Should she be nominated and clench that nomination, the Democratic one, won't that hurt her if then she is indicted? It would be the first time that a candidate running for president is indicted.
I think it would hurt her a lot because she really is the only establishment candidate that we have in either party. And at first, everyone thought it was her election to lose, but we found that there's a lot of support behind Sanders.
Right.
Although, again, that is somewhat mirroring the Republican Party electorate. The supporters for Sanders also feel that they've been left out of decision-making in Washington, but from the left wing.
Analysts say that Bernie Sanders should be the one to go up against Donald Trump, should Donald Trump win the nomination, just because he would have a higher chance of beating him in the November elections. Do you agree?
I'm mixed on that. I think that Sanders, while he is an insider, so to speak, you know, he's been a senator for a long time in Washington. He was a governor, a mayor before that.
Right.
But never governor, actually, just mayor. But he needs to get more support of the Democratic Party high-ups. And Hillary has that support.
Right.
And she has it among Democratic elites across the country. And she has been doing well, just not as well as she expected. And so the Democrat Party, just like the Republican Party, is really much further along in the primary cycle, not having chosen a candidate than we've seen in quite some time.
Can you, if you know, I know we're just in April, but do you want to make a prediction of who you think will be the next president of the United States?
I think it will be Clinton.
Okay.
Still, because of a number of things, but.
So come November elections, the voter base for Trump, it can't, you know, I mean, we've seen his numbers get hurt a little bit because of the recent...
And also that he's never had a majority of even the Republican voters.
Right.
So he's had a plurality,
right,
but he hasn't had a majority. And once he goes against the Democratic nominee, and even a third party, if the Republican Party decides to go that route, it's almost impossible for him to win. Unless there were really a way to split the majority of Americans between two candidates, maybe he could eke out a plurality. But all of these things are deeply destabilizing to the system, which in some ways is what people want. They're fed up with the system. But on the other hand, it's going on too many fronts. Both parties are facing, you know, significant kind of infighting inside them. How elections are run in the U.S. We've noticed recently it was a disaster in Arizona, and Arizona wasn't the only place.
He's had he came under fire recently from U.S. President Barack Obama on the statements he made on nuclear, on Japan, and was it Japan and North Korea should acquire nuclear weapons in order to protect themselves. I just want to show this clip from President Barack Obama.
They tell us that the person who made the statements doesn't know much about foreign policy or nuclear policy or the Korean Peninsula or the world generally. It came up on the sidelines. I've said before that, you know, people pay attention to American elections. What we do is really important to the rest of the world.
What we do is really important to the rest of the world. People are really watching these elections closely, and President Obama has been very critical, softly so, about Donald Trump and just his run and what he's been up to so far. But he's also promised, as this could be the first time in history, where two Democratic presidents back-to-back are elected. It's never happened before. And I wanted to ask, you know, as we conclude, what do you think President Obama's legacy is going to be? He's seen his approval ratings go up probably because of the whole commotion happening on the Republican side.
His popularity has gone up as of late. It's now on par with Ronald Reagan, a very popular U.S. president, by the time he left office. And I think a few things are at work. One, particularly Democrats, but also independents who had been on the fence about Obama, now look and see whatever the weaknesses of the Obama administration has been for the past 7 years. They're far outweighed by the negatives of particularly the Republican Party coming up. But I think also Obama has been working. One of the things that we see in Congress, and this is reflected in their loss of popularity, something like 11% of Americans think they're doing an okay job. Twice that feel they're doing a horrible job. And Congress has really been stuck, and Congress has been in control of the Republicans for the past few years.
Right. So going into this next election, what is the hope?
What's the hope? Well, a hope that the American elections can somehow
get back to seriousness for one,
get back
right?
to the seriousness.
Because the world is kind of looking at this in a comedic
but
kind of
also
way.
For more people to understand that the policies and procedures that we follow are actually helpful so that whoever comes out as the victor, people will largely accept it. With the Supreme Court missing, you know, one of its justices, the Republican Party saying they're not going to even talk to the nominee until after the election, elections on a state-by-state basis in the U.S. not faring well, being increasingly politicized. There's a lot of procedural things that can go wrong, and all of that will contribute to I hate to use the word, but chaos, potential chaos when we finally get to the elections.
Right. You have to come back and tell us more as we get closer to the November elections. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
That was Dr. Jennifer Skulti-Awais talking about the upcoming U.S. elections and what's been happening so far. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Yumna. And on that note, we end our bulletin for today. Now for a recap of our top stories. Marada movement leader Sleiman Frangieh meets with Mufti of Tripoli and the North, Sheikh Malik al-Shahar, and rejects accusations that Future Movement chief Saad Hariri interfered in Christian affairs when he nominated him for the presidency. Armed clashes renew at the Ain al-Helwe Palestinian refugee camp in Sidon after heavy clashes erupted overnight. And the Syrian opposition says it is not optimistic about upcoming peace talks in Geneva because there is no international will for a political transition. Those are your top stories for today. Thank you all for watching us.
بقول له يا سيد أنا رجعت على لبنان، أتمنى إنك ترجع كمان على لبنان.
قرار صادر من مجلس الجامعة تسمية حزب الله الإرهابي.